Good evening, everybody. It's a long time since I've been able to have the pleasure of introducing someone on one of these Zoom chats. I'm Beth Dominiani, the library director. I suspect I know everybody, but just in case. Well, we have a wonderful program for you this evening. And let's get started. To research their recently published book, Genus Americanus, a 70-year-old Northwestern, 70-year-old or so, I guess, Northwestern journalism professor, Loren Ghiglione, and two 20-something Northwestern journalism students, Alyssa and Tham, climbed into a minivan and embarked on a 3-month, 28-state, 14,063-mile road trip in search of America's identity. After interviewing 150 Americans about contemporary identity issues, they wrote a book, which is a part of an oral history, part shoe leather reporting, part search for America's future, part memoir, and part travel journal. On their journey, they retraced Mark Twain's travels across America, from Hannibal, Missouri, to Chicago, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Salt Lake City, San Francisco, and Seattle. They hope that Twain's insights into the late 19th century soul of America would help them understand America of today in the ways that our cultural fabric has shifted. Their interviews focused on issues of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and immigration status. What they learned along the way paints an emerging portrait of the country during this crucial moment of our time and political upheaval. One of their stops along the way, as they retraced Twain's footsteps, was right here in Reading. The late Heather Morgan and I were delighted to share treasures from the library's archives and guide them along what we all finally in Reading call the Reading Twain Trail. Today, I'm very delighted that two of the trio are able to join us. The distinguished journalist, Loren Ghiglione, is a veteran of a half-century in journalism education, and as Professor of Emeritus of Journalism at Northwestern University. He owned and edited the Southbridge, Massachusetts Evening News and ran that parent company for 26 years. He served as a 4-time Pulitzer Prize juror, a guest curator of a 1990 Library of Congress exhibit, and president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. He's the author or editor of 9 books. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, he created a groundbreaking disabilities committee and initiated a landmark study of gays and lesbians in U.S. newsrooms. Then a student when he saw us in Reading, Tham is now a producer for CNN's Global Features team based in Hong Kong. He's responsible for producing premium original programming for TV, digital, and social platforms. His work ranges from travel to business to social justice media. Dan joined CNN in 2013. He was previously based at the network's Atlanta headquarters, where he helped produce long-form features with their documentary unit. Of course, he holds his undergraduate degree in broadcast journalism from Northwestern University. Before we go on to our speakers, I would like to extend a thank you to the Reading League of Women Voters, our co-sponsor of the Conversations on Race series, and to the Mark Twain Foundation for their generous support of the library's Twain in Reading programming. Please sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy a wonderful presentation. It's a great pleasure to again welcome both of these gentlemen back to Reading. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Beth, for your generous introduction and for having us back to the Mark Twain Library. It's really an honor. Gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson wrote, "Old Americans go out on the highway and drive themselves to death. But our 14,000-mile drive around America, which loosely followed, as you indicated, the path of Mark Twain, was for me a drive to live, to take a pulse of America, to do some roots research about the Ghigliones, family or non-family, to experience the education of the open road, to interview people I'd never met, and friends from decades earlier about race, sexual orientation, and other hot button identity issues. Twain wrote, "There ain't no surer way to find out whether you like people or hate them than to travel with them." I really liked my traveling companions, Alyssa Karras and Dan Tham, and I'm sorry Alyssa can't join us this evening. She graduated from the journalism school and had rejected immediately pursuing a prestigious journalism job, the normal goal of journalism students, to work 70 to 80 hours a week as our trips well below minimum wage everything: navigator, travel agent, copy editor, text specialist, photographer, and Advil dispenser. I soon experienced the merry, mischievous side of Alyssa, whose motto is, "Everything is a good time or a good story." Halfway from Evanston to Hannibal, Missouri, our first night's destination, Alyssa and I stopped at the Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site in Collinsville, Illinois. The museum's information center insisted that Alyssa and I wear laminated writing permit badges on strings around our necks. I thought of a character in a Nathaniel Hawthorne novel, the bearer of an illegitimate child, who was required to wear a scarlet A for adulteress on her dress. At the end of our Cahokia visit, I grumbled to a staff person about the writing permit requirement as I returned my laminated badge. Alyssa did me one better. She stole hers. Dan, who is fortunately with us this evening, was a junior, and he was taking the trip as a one-credit course. And he was joining Alyssa and me 2 days after our beginning the Odyssey, returning from internships in India and Germany that reflected his interest in reporting on the world's outliers. Credit his upbringing. He recalled his time in white-bread, heavily Mormon Salt Lake City as a quadruple minority: Asian, gay, Buddhist, and vegetarian. While Dan achieved in the way most journalism students wanted to achieve, as a senior, he would win Northwestern's top broadcast journalism award. He also explored what it means to be an outlier. He was the first man to live with a woman in Northwestern's inaugural gender-neutral housing. For a course on Chicago's immigrant and multi-ethnic communities, he reported on Koreans and Tibetans, at one point finding himself in the middle of a protest for Tibetan freedom outside the Chinese embassy. Beth, you indicated that we interviewed 150 Americans. While I interviewed most of them, I invited Alyssa and Dan to interview people of special interest to them. So tonight, in the limited time we have, we're going to try to do two things: introduce some of the people in the book, so you get a sense of the diversity of the Americans we talked with, and then just have an exchange of our reflections on the trip and what was the most important to us, what astonished us, what disappointed us, and so on. I conducted the trip's first interview at the Mark Twain Birthplace Museum in Stoutsville, Missouri, with 61-year-old museum guide Connie Ritter. She recalled as a child never entering the museum. Quote, "No one ever told us we couldn't go inside," she said, "but we knew we couldn't go inside, and now I work here." She said that at the beginning, Mark Twain wasn't my cup of tea. I hated Mark Twain because of Nigger Jim. She questioned Twain's use of the African-American character in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It took me a while to understand what I understand about Huck Finn now. Ritter considers the novel an assault on racism. Ritter used her position at the museum to highlight the role of slavery in the area, nicknamed Little Dixie. The area had a disproportionately large number of plantations, slaves, and lynchings. In 2010, she added a slavery display to the museum's exhibit. The display showed a reproduction ball and chain, a foot-wide 7¾ pound ball attached by a short chain to a slave's ankle, that demonstrated how hard it would have been for a slave to escape. When I returned to the museum in 2015, and I should add that traveling on a trip like this, when you only have an hour or so to interview somebody, realizes you really have to retravel America. to learn more about the people you interviewed, and also to interview other people to fill in holes in the story. Anyway, when I visited in 2015, I learned Ritter had retired in December 2014. The museum no longer employed any African Americans. Her slavery display had been taken down, supposedly only for as long as it would take to get proper permission to use the photos in the display. But in late 2017, 3 years after Ritter's retirement, the slavery display remained in the museum's basement. Marianne Bodine, an interpretive research specialist, talked about renovating the museum's exhibits as a 10-year project. If the museum displayed a slavery exhibit, she said, it would be down the line a bit, not anytime soon. I telephoned Ritter at her home. She hoped the slavery display would return. I received so much positive feedback, she said. The exhibit's removal seemed to foreshadow, in the time of Trump, regression on race. The trip may sound romantic with all of this Mark Twain and so on, but I thought I'd ask Dan if he could talk about not only the romance of it, being on the Mississippi River in a riverboat and all of that, but also the daily routine and his visit to a hospital in Nashville. Before he answers, I just wanted you to see this map of the United States, and you can see how we wound our way around the United States. It only takes 3,000 miles to go directly across, but it took us 14,000 miles because we insisted on following Mark Twain's path as first as a printer's devil going to New York City and Philadelphia. Then he became a riverboat pilot and went down to New Orleans, regularly on a route from St. Louis to New Orleans. And then out west, where he was a reporter when he failed at prospecting in Nevada Territory and San Francisco. And then we included Seattle because when he went bankrupt and late in his life, he started a world-round trip to get solvent from Seattle. That was the last place in the United States before going to India and South Africa and so on. So Dan, any thoughts?
Thank you everyone for joining this evening. It's really a pleasure to be here with Loren to talk about our trip from all these years ago. Of course, road trips are a very kind of mythologized thing in kind of American life. And so, on the whole, it was a very beautiful way to see the country. But of course, it had its moments as well. You get fatigued driving through certain states that are, kind of the landscape doesn't shift very much. But I think we did a very good job of making sure that everyone kind of, drove more or less equally. While one person drove, the other two would sleep in the back. And I remember stopping at lots of really special restaurants that are kind of like local specialties in the various places we went. Particularly, I'd call out Doe's Eat Place in Greenville, Mississippi, Red Rooster in Harlem. A lot of these places that Loren had visited in his past that he wanted to introduce us to. So that was really a treat. But being on the road for 3 months, we were staying at the cheapest motels possible in order to kind of maximize our budget. And I remember it was in Nashville, Tennessee. The motel was really creepy. I slept with the light on, and I think it ended up giving me a really bad headache when I woke up. So I ended up having to go to the hospital, and we lost an entire day of work because of this horrific migraine that I got because I was too afraid of sleeping at night. So there were some mishaps like that on the way, but I have to say, on the whole, it was really smooth.
Thanks, Dan. We also, I wanted to introduce you to Michael Gaines, who grew up on a farm near Bethel, Missouri. He was the only openly gay man in Hannibal that we were told about. And so we went to talk to him. He runs the Hannibal Arts Council. He reassured us that there was really nothing difficult about living in the town. He was accepted despite we had seen a Facebook, an incident where the local Baptist affiliated college had refused to readmit a student who had announced on Facebook that he was gay. So Gaines told us a story about returning to his hometown of Bethel, Missouri, 3 or 4 times a year to play the piano at the Bethel Christian Church, his church since junior high. It was as much my family as my family was, he said. When church elders learned he and his partner had been living together, they took Gaines aside and told him he never again would be allowed to be part of the worship team and play the piano during services. But he joined the Bowling Green Disciples of Christ Church and welcomed his piano playing during services. The church I grew up might change their attitude or they may not, but it is really not of my concern now, Gaines said. Moving on. He talked optimistically about cultural changes. Sometimes they take a while to trickle down to small town America, he said, but he remained committed to Hannibal. I feel loved and appreciated for who I am and for the work I do. That's pretty good for anyone. He mentioned a young man who came up to him at a party and told him how much he valued Gaines being himself in the community. My doing that made a real difference to some of his gay friends in high school, Gaines said. Made my day. The trade-off for me to move to a bigger city would be that I would actually lose a part of myself, something that most people might say I lose by staying here. We went to Chicago after going through St. Louis, and I just recall Barbara Zeman, after we had visited a Deacon Ghiglione, you know, we were looking for Ghigliones everywhere, and he had very strongly talked about the position of the church on Catholic Church on LGBT gay community, and I guess the Pope is changing that policy. I was hearing today on the radio, but also on women priests, that there would never be women priests. So we attended in Chicago the 40th anniversary Mass of Dignity Chicago, a congregation that served LGBTQ Catholics. Barbara Zeman, here pictured, led 55 Dignity Chicago congregants in singing, "For everyone born a place at the table, to live without fear and simply to be." Later, the 64-year-old Zeman described her path to becoming a priest, which began with a traditional Catholic upbringing. She attended Catholic schools, Catholic University. She felt a call to the priesthood. The Second Vatican Council suggested anything might be possible. She thought the church soon might open the doors to women leaders and allow lay people to take ownership of our church, she said, but that failed to happen. In 1998, still seeking answers about the place of women in the church, she earned a master's in theology, and in 2002, she learned that male bishops in Europe were ordaining women as priests, but they were doing so in secret, she said, because if their identities became known, they would be removed from their duties and put under house arrest by the Vatican. In 2008, the Vatican decreed excommunication for any woman who sought ordination. Nevertheless, that year, a female bishop from Roman Catholic Women Priests, an organization not sanctioned by the Catholic Church, ordained Zeman in Chicago. Hundreds of women, Catholic women, have been similarly ordained worldwide since then. And in response, in 2010, the Vatican categorized ordinations of women as serious a crime as priest sexual abuse of children. I'm going to be who I am, Zeman said. In 2018, 60% of US Catholics felt women should be permitted to be priests, but Zeman doubted the Catholic Church would change its position on the role of women priests. Quote, "These guys are playing hardball. It's about power, not about Jesus." So while I was interviewing all these Ghigliones along the way, Deacon Ghiglione being the most recent, and other Italian Americans, beginning in Chicago, Dan started introducing us to Vietnamese Americans. And I'm curious, Dan, what similarities and differences struck you about their experiences, these two different immigrant groups?
Sure. I was really inspired by your obsession, I guess, with meeting every Ghiglione that lived in the United States. So, you know, I think early on in the trip, I suggested that it would be great if we also spoke to some Vietnamese Americans and to find out what their, excuse me, what their experience was in this country. You know, I'm the son of refugees as well from Vietnam, so I've always had kind of a curiosity about that history. I think as far as similarities, there's some very superficial ones. You know, tight-knit families and an obsession for food, that kind of thing. But also, you know, I noticed kind of a tension that I think is kind of universal to the immigrant experience, of the first generation arrivals trying their best to kind of integrate, to assimilate into American society, and to, you know, for all intents and purposes, kind of shirk their past and kind of fit in. But then in subsequent generations, I think embodied by you and me, Loren, there was a curiosity for roots research, to try to understand, you know, your ancestry and where you came from. So I'm happy that we both kind of fit into the latter camp. As far as differences are concerned, I think it's just kind of a matter of, you know, the amount of time that we spent in the U.S. The Vietnamese arrived in the 70s and 80s for the most part, and so the kind of shared history with the U.S. is fairly short. Whereas your great grandfather arrived from Italy in 1872, so about 100 years before, you know, my family did. And so you do notice that with the Ghigliones that we met around the country, they had basically fully integrated into American life culturally and linguistically and in many ways. Whereas I think for the Vietnamese in the U.S., it's still an ongoing process. But your question does remind me of a quote from Viet Thanh Nguyen, who's the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for his 2015 novel, The Sympathizer. He wrote about the Vietnamese refugees: "We were not a people who charged into war at the beck and call of bugle or trumpet. No, we fought to the tune of love songs, for we were the Italians of Asia." So I thought that was a kind of a nice tie-in between our two ideas.
Oh, that's wonderful, Dan. So as a gay man, do you think you experienced our visit we visited this home of Dr. Larry Mass in New York City. And I knew him because he was one of the first, if not the first, person who reported on HIV/AIDS, long before people at the New York Times were reporting on it. And so I've known him for a while. And so we visited with him. And I was just wondering, and this is a painting of him and his partner. I'm wondering, as a gay man, Dan, how you experienced that visit to his home in New York City. And I recall this trip, the first part of it that we're talking about, was in 2011, before President Trump was elected. And I remember something that Dr. Mass said to us. There's that famous saying by Santayana: "Those who don't learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them," Mass said. I'm reading from our book. "I've created an addendum to that. They will repeat them even if they've learned history, as long as they think they can get away with it. History can turn on a dime," Mass mused. He insisted a Hitler-style demagogue could foment public targeting of African Americans, Muslim Americans, or gays. Quote, "It doesn't have to be Jews," Mass said. "When the public starts going crazy, when the public starts getting that fever of bondedness about something, rationality drops away, and the mass psychology of fascism takes over." Mass's description of inhuman human behavior recalled Twain's maxim that man is the only animal that blushes or needs to. Dan, any thoughts about our visit? I can't hear you. Can you hear?
Yeah, sorry about that. I was muted. I think reflecting now on our trip from 9 years ago, Mass's words were very almost prophetic. You know, I remember thinking about the interview we had with him during the Charlottesville protests, and sort of, you know, these sentiments that he expressed to us all these years ago kind of came true in a way, in a very frightening manner. As a gay man, I guess I enjoy a lot of privilege in terms of all the groundwork that the older generation of the LGBT community paved for us. So I remember being struck by Mass's sort of dismay at the, current young generation and their kind of cavalier attitude towards HIV/AIDS. Mass was one of the co-founders of the gay men's health crisis in New York City back in 1982. So he had seen really firsthand the devastation that the disease brought on the community. And so it was such an honor to meet someone that played such a fundamental role in making sure that, my generation and the ones that come after, that we enjoy kind of these privileges. So it was eye-opening, really.
Thanks, Dan. So in Hartford, we visited Ingrid Mattson. Just want to introduce her by saying many Americans viewed Muslims' religion, Islam, as an anti-Christian faith, fraudulent, destructive, and evil. In Innocents Abroad, a young, ignorant Mark Twain portrayed Muslim leaders as bloodthirsty savages on a par with American Indians, whom Twain also denounced as subhuman. He wrote, "Muslims' natural instincts do not permit them to be moral." That perception of Muslims and of Islam was reinforced by the coordinated terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Dan and Alyssa and I talked about this with Ingrid Mattson, whom the New York Times labeled perhaps the most noticed figure among American Muslim women. She directed Hartford Seminary's McDonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations. She also was the first woman, the first non-immigrant, and the first Muslim convert to head the Islamic Society of North America. She grew up Roman Catholic and attended a Catholic girls' high school, but she stopped going to Mass at 16. A precocious unbeliever I was, and identified as an agnostic. Impressed by the dignity and generosity of spirit of West African Muslims she met while studying in Paris, she started reading the Quran, converted to Islam, and earned a PhD in Islamic studies. She stressed the importance of treating Muslims as individuals and recognizing that Islam is not anti-Western or anti-modernity. The vast majority of America's 5 to 8 million Muslims, a quarter of whom are African Americans, integrated themselves into US culture. Some adopted anglicized names, married non-Muslims, and thoroughly assimilated. Others proudly held on to distinctive Muslim names, dress, and traditions, still pursuing the American dream. They saw the United States, by and large, as a multicultural democracy that, while often flawed, valued law and liberty, including religious freedom. She struck me as a modern Muslim woman who was as progressive as a Muslim woman can be and still show respect for traditional aspects of Islam's culture. She sided with the majority of Muslims who felt that the imam, the officiating priest of a mosque, should be a male if called on to lead prayer for a congregation of women and men. She wore a headscarf and covered all but her hands and face, which she viewed as an act of equality and empowerment that helped free her from being judged on her appearance. But she kept her surname when she married. She mowed the family's lawn while her husband served as primary family cook. She shared equally with her husband in raising their 2 children. American Muslims, Mattson said, have had an unfair burden placed on them since 9/11. They are expected to eradicate radical Muslim terrorists and their sympathizers. We would love to, but we are not in control of those people, Mattson said to us. These horrible people are terrorizing everyone. More Muslims have been killed by ISIS than non-Muslims. Muslims are like other people in that we have our good guys and our bad guys. Don't judge Muslim people by the worst of them. Dan, do you recall your reaction to Ingrid Mattson?
Yeah, I'm a little embarrassed to, I guess, admit it, but I guess I came into the interview with some unconscious bias about, what a Muslim woman could be, really. And I kind of talk it up a little bit to post 9/11 Islamophobia that was really rampant in our country. I guess I was taken aback by the fact that Mattson was so, forthcoming, mirthful, just engaging, charismatic, all of these things that I guess I had never seen just for lack of exposure, really. So it was a learning moment for me to meet Ingrid.
Thanks, Dan. Dan, you had couple of incredible interviews, and I thought you might talk about Giuseppe Anthony Tran and Troy Williams.
Yeah, sure. So this is a Vietnamese man that we interviewed in New Orleans. In New Orleans, the Vietnamese community commemorated the 4 decades since the end of the Vietnam War a little differently. Everywhere else, they were mourning, Giuseppe Anthony Tran said. Here, we celebrated 40 years of success, evaluating ourselves and seeing what we've done. Tran was born in 1964 to a family of rice farmers in Hat Tien, a beach town at the southernmost tip of Vietnam. During his childhood, an unexploded shell jutted out from the ground right in front of his house. Every day, the little boy, then known as Thuan, Vietnamese for safe and secure, would touch the shell with wonder. Like a Vietnamese Huckleberry Finn, Tran, when he was 16, decided to flee the country on a raft with 11 other young Vietnamese, total strangers and most of them teenagers. My mom saved a lot to put me on board, Tran said. I would say the equivalent to $400. That's a lot in Vietnam in the 80s. He was the youngest of 7 siblings, just 2 years shy of military age. He would either leave the country then or never have the chance. Living under the communists, you get the feeling that you don't have another day to live, he said. Everything is controlled. That's why I told my parents I don't see any future here. He left on the night of April 30th, 1981, while the communists were celebrating 6 years since the end of the war. It was everyone's first time at sea. No one knew how to properly maneuver the raft. They had no compass, no map. By night, they faced heavy storms. By day, the sun fried their skin into rice paper, Tran recalled. Eventually, and miraculously, they landed at the border between Malaysia and Thailand. Although it was a poor village in the province of Narathiwat, at least it was in Vietnam. Once word spread that a group of Vietnamese refugees had arrived in the village, the government of Thailand took them in, placing the group in the Song Kla refugee camp. Tran started making plans with his older brother to come to the United States. His brother Thuong, however, was a priest, wasn't allowed to take in another person. So his brother asked an Italian-American couple he knew through Catholic Charities to co-sponsor Tran. Francisco and Evelyn Giovanni, who lived in Chicago, took Tran in, named him Giuseppe Anthony, put him through high school and college. That's why I'm in love with Italy, Tran said. I'm Italian Vietnamese living in America. Eventually, Tran settled in the Village de l'Est neighborhood in New Orleans, a neighborhood known for its Vietnamese community. The river there is crowded with lily pads. Many of the men are shrimpers by trade. In Village de l'Est, there's a distinct feeling of quê hương, or homeland. The feeling of unity is there, Tran said, and it's lovely. He had been to other Vietnamese communities in Texas and California, but nothing compared to Village de l'Est in New Orleans. For the Vietnamese community, which had so often experienced exodus and relocation from North to South Vietnam, from Vietnam to refugee camps, and from those camps to America and elsewhere, the devastation wrought by Katrina in 2005 was yet another experience of moving from one place to another. During the hurricane, it took Tran 28 hours to reach Dallas from New Orleans, usually an 8-hour trip. As Tran told it, 2 weeks after the storm, the displaced Vietnamese came right back and fixed their homes. We shoveled out the mud, picked up, cleaned up, came back strong. Tran now serves as the parish coordinator of the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church. Over a meal of Vietnamese food at Bát Mien restaurant, Tran told me, with my life, I feel I had more than I wished for. Looking back on the journey, everything was a blessing all along.
Thanks, Dan. That reminds me, before you go talk about Troy Williams, we visited Louisiana State Penitentiary, which it's on the Mississippi River. It's as large, it's even larger than Manhattan. About 6,000 inmates, 80% African American, and the warden insisted that everybody, they were either labeled black or white. So we asked to interview people who were not either black or white. And we had trouble getting approval. Finally, the Louisiana ACLU helped us get interviews with some Native Americans, and Dan managed to talk with a Vietnamese American, and I just thought it might be interesting, his experience, because he spoke to him in Vietnamese, and I'm curious as to how that went.
Yeah, sure. This was the second maximum security prison visit on our trip. The first being Elmira Correctional Facility in upstate New York. I remember when I met Hao Nguyen, whose nickname was Hop Sing in the prison. He was serving a life sentence. It was almost a looking glass moment for me. He looked so much like my uncles, you know, back in Salt Lake. And I remember him telling me when we were chatting that he hadn't spoken Vietnamese in years. So I don't know. This kind of shook me to the core. After we left Angola, I thought about How a lot, and really reflected on, you know, this kind of stereotype of Asians in America, of the Vietnamese community, also of tiger moms and overachievers. And while it's definitely true to some extent, meeting How Nguyen really underscored for me that this sort of model minority myth really kind of erases the real struggles and problems that are, you know, happening in the Asian community. And yeah, so you know, I wrote him a letter. A few years later, I never got a reply, but I think about our meeting often.
Thanks, Dan. You may have not gotten a reply because actually I tried to track him down to get permission to use his photo. And to do that, I learned that he was taken to another prison and they forwarded the letter. So it worked out in the end, but that may have been the problem. So you returned home to Salt Lake City, and we had some really interesting interviews there. I interviewed an African-American Mormon woman, and she talked about the experience of being Black in the Mormon church. And you interviewed Troy Williams.
Yeah. Here's another excerpt from the book. In 2008, the Mormon Church in Utah publicly supported Proposition 8 in California. It was a constitutional amendment that would ban same-sex marriage. 1 year later, in July 2009, a gay couple was arrested after one kissed the other on the cheek near the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City, my hometown. Troy Williams, who I knew from my time working at the community radio station, KRCL, was outraged when he heard the news. Williams was at that point the executive producer and co-host of Radioactive, a talk show centered on grassroots activism. He's also been referred to as the gay mayor of Salt Lake City by the Salt Lake Tribune. So, inspired by the sit-ins of the civil rights era, Williams organized 3 so-called kiss-ins at the exact plaza where the gay couple was handcuffed. The rallies he led, attended by both gay and straight couples, lips locked in protest, were aimed at calling out the Mormon Church and a religion that he was once a part of. Williams said LGBT activism in Utah could be a model for other marginalized groups in the US. If you go to large urban centers of queer people, you see lots of divisions, Williams said. Here in Utah, we don't have the kind of luxury to have those divisions. We just don't. Williams said that the recent spotlight on Mormonism, a Broadway musical, a GOP presidential candidate in Mitt Romney, has put pressure on the Mormon Church to reevaluate its position on homosexuality. He cites the fact that until 1978, Mormon African-American men were denied the right to hold the priesthood. Under pressure from non-Mormons in the US, church leadership allegedly received a revelation from God that allowed the Mormons to change their position. If the church is to survive, Williams said, it's going to have to wake up in a big way. It's going to have to draw down the powers of heaven and actually come up with a revelation. Otherwise, this rising generation is going to say, not interested. For all the differences the Mormons have with the LGBT community and vice versa, Williams said the two groups have a lot more in common than people would believe. Mormons and queer people know what it's like to be hated for being different, Williams said, so they ought to have empathy. The Mormons were radical communitarians who practiced a different marital form, polygamy. They fled the US in the mid-1800s and settled in the Salt Lake Valley, ensconced in the Rocky Mountains and flanked by desert. When the Utah Territory was incorporated in the United States in 1896, the Mormons felt a tremendous need to assimilate and prove that they were just regular Americans. Williams said the marginalized and persecuted groups tend to show they've become good and worthy Americans by finding another group and ostracizing them. They forget their own history of oppression and start to contribute to the oppression of others, Williams said. That's what the Latter-day Saints have done. Since our interview with Williams, he's gone on to become the executive director of Equality Utah, an LGBT advocacy organization. A long-awaited hate crimes law was passed in 2019 in Utah, and gay conversion therapy was banned in the state in January of this year.
Thanks, Dan. Well, this is a a slide of us. When we got out west, we made sure to visit Virginia City, where Twain had prospected and became a reporter. And there was so we thought in honor of Twain, we should be very Western. And here we are as barmaid and bank robbers. So it wasn't all serious interviews. So one of the things that I thought we experienced throughout the trip was a sense of how ignorant we were about Native Americans. We stopped at the Kickapoo Reservation in Kansas for a day and a half. And then when we got to California, I managed to go to the San Francisco, the oldest mission in San Francisco, Mission Dolores, which was founded by Spanish priests in 1776. I was really taken by the message of this assistant curator, Vincent Medina. And he talked about, he's only 27, but he's very active in his tribe. And he said that almost 6,000 Native Americans constituted the largest group buried at the mission. And he was very tough on the Spanish priests. He said Spanish priests such as Juniper Serra, founder of the California missions, who was given sainthood by Pope Francis in 2015, saw the missions as utopian Christian communities to help the Indians and save their souls. In reality, the missions were, Medina said, horrible places similar to concentration camps. Once baptized, Indians were held against their will. They were treated as slaves, their land taken, their labor exploited. A detachment of soldiers shackled and whipped those who tried to flee. Unmarried Indian women were forced to work as spinners and weavers when they were not being driven into the mission for mass or lessons in church doctrine. By 1843, the mission's total Indian population of at least 1,000 had been reduced to 8 aged starvelings. That experience drove Medina to work at Mission Dolores, where he offered an Indian perspective on the history of the mission. Medina also committed to a larger challenge to change the way the story of the missions was told and taught throughout California in a required 4th grade unit on the missions. Some mission curators resisted, but he helped this California Indian Culture and Sovereignty Center develop a website about Indian opposition to the mission. He worked at Heyday, the publisher of books about California Indians, as an outreach coordinator. He is determined, he said, to make concrete change happen. In San Francisco, we had some wonderful interviews, but one evening, our parked van fell victim to smash and grabbers. They escaped with our video cameras, 2 laptop computers, and Alyssa's 2 suitcases. The loss of irreplaceable video interviews and photos hit us hard. The story got better the next morning. Someone named Kimberly Kills tweeted Alyssa and asked where she was. Alyssa replied San Francisco and learned that Kills had found one of her suitcases after midnight on a sidewalk in Oakland, about 10 miles from San Francisco. In arranging for us to meet Kills at a Starbucks in Oakland to pick up her bag, Alyssa said, "I think she's a porn star." Alyssa appeared to be right. KimKills.com called Kills, quote, one of the hottest natural transsexual porn stars on this planet, unquote. Kills described herself as a 28-year-old transgender male to female actor. At any rate, we wound up going to the Starbucks in Oakland and retrieving Alyssa's bag, and here they are pictured together. She was, she almost looks like a sister. Certainly she was a sister of kindness to us. I also wanted to, we've been talking a lot about immigrants. And when we got to Seattle, where Twain left for his around the world trip to get solvent again, I, of course, was interested in if there were Ghigliones. Well, there were some, and it brought back stories about my great-grandfather, Angelo Francesco Ghiglione, pictured here, and he was a typical entrepreneur, immigrant entrepreneur, working very hard, but the family was really run by his wife, Maria Strada Ghiglione. And because we don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to say a few things about her. She made everybody attend Sunday dinner. Even when family dinners were held at her son's homes in Seattle, she dictated what was to be served. She hung on to the old world. Her Ligurian dialect was incomprehensible to a grandchild who had learned Italian. Those who disobeyed Maria were called, in translation, turnip heads or idiot. Maria's superstitions ruled. We couldn't have 13 at the dinner table, and we always had 13 in the family, Mabel Lucas, a granddaughter, said. She didn't want a handkerchief as a gift. A handkerchief meant crying or sharp things because they would cut a friendship. She sought perfection in everything. When she visited a children's home, upon sitting down to eat, she would pick up the plate and rub her finger across it to make sure there was no grease on it. She insisted on the freshest of vegetables and fruits from her garden, everything planted by the moon or from Seattle's Pike Street Market, which was founded by an Italian immigrant. She ordered the Pike Street Market vendors to give her the best or else. She had a trinity of traditional values: honor, cleanliness, thrift. And when she when her husband came home with $5, not every cent of his pay, and said, I bought a few rounds for the boys at work, she exploded, okay, if you're going to drink it up, I'm going to burn it up. And she screamed, tossing the $5 bill in a parlor stove. As much as I admire the entrepreneurial spirit of my great-grandfather and the values of my great-grandmother, I was taken by their son, Dr. August Ghiglione, for a couple of reasons. Here he is in the center as the surgeon, chief surgeon at Providence Hospital, the largest private hospital in Seattle. He was also counsel to the Italian community in the region in the Pacific Northwest. When the Black Hand, a criminal syndicate formed by Italian immigrants, tried to extort money from other Italian immigrants, Dr. Ghiglione aided police in breaking up the plot. For a time, he traveled with a bodyguard and carried a gun in his car. One night, he put his Pope Hartford in his garage. He and his wife and their 2 children retired for the evening. Shortly after midnight, the garage exploded. The Seattle Daily Times carried front-page photos. The headline shouted, "Dynamite outrage perpetrated against Italian consular agent Ghiglione." Under the headline of "The Shame of Seattle," the Post-Intelligencer editorialized about the corrupt police, the partnership between the police chief and criminal classes, and the chief's unwillingness to protect Dr. Ghiglione and his family. When Dr. Ghiglione wasn't dealing with corrupt police, he helped meet the medical needs of impoverished Italian Americans. His patients were primarily truck gardeners and laborers from southern and central Italy who lived in neighborhoods with nicknames like Garlic Gulch. He spoke their Italian dialects, wrote prescriptions in English or Italian, and conveniently forgot to charge patients who lacked the money to pay. What impressed me most, I think, was that as the Italian counsel, he defended immigrants against criticism in Seattle. When a Seattle Times reader disparaged Italian, Chinese, and Japanese immigrants in 1910, Dr. Ghiglione attacked the reader's ignorance and misinformation. He defended immigrants' patriotism and dismissed the reader's call for immigration restriction as amounting to, quote, air bubbles. In response to the reader's claim that Italians were violent criminals, Dr. Ghiglione cited a study of Italians in America that concluded, generally speaking, they are gentle drudges, honest, faithful, and inoffensive. He foresaw an America enriched and enlivened for generations to come by its immigrants, by people of different races, ethnicities, religions, and visions of what life in the United States could be. Perhaps this is a good place to stop. I can't help but note, by contrast, the Trump administration's pursuit of the destruction of immigration in America. And I invite your questions about our Odyssey or comments. We, again, thank you for joining us tonight, and we're really honored to be at the library, even if it's by Zoom.
Well, thank you, and we're thrilled that you're here, and welcome back. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the chat, and then I can read it to Dan and Loren. Or if you would like to unmute yourself at this time and ask a question, that would be lovely. You can also type next into the chat function, and then I'll know you would like to speak next if someone else is speaking.
Gus, this is Gus.
Thank you, Gus. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yes, we're at the Mark Twain Library, so to speak, and we're talking about Mark Twain and his travels. And I gather that he's not at all considered a racist, and he was very much of an anti-imperialist also. Is there some specific relevance to Mark Twain and his attitude to race that we could discuss, or is that not relevant to this particular discussion?
No, it's highly relevant. I think he's a complex figure when it comes to talking about race. He knew African Americans, and his family, as I think you know, had a slave coming into where he was born in Missouri, Florida, Missouri. But he was not as comfortable, indeed he was very critical of Native Americans and Muslims. I think there he did not know people that he was talking about. And it was the sort of offhand comments that he would make about Italians and the French when in Innocents Abroad, you know, witty, sarcastic comments. I remember visiting, we in New Haven, we visited Yale Law School, and when Mark Twain visited Yale to speak in the 1880s, he was taken around by an African-American student from the law school. And he was so impressed by him. The student was, you know, having to work 3 jobs, collecting credit from students and waiting tables and a variety of other jobs. And at any rate, Twain quietly went to the dean of the law school and said, you know, we haven't treated people of color fairly. And so he paid for the education of the student without any recognition. I don't know that much is known about that experience, but it impressed me. So, you know, I think there are scholars who say he never got away from having a view that whites were superior to Black Americans. And I remember when he was interviewed in India on that round the world trip, he was asked about mixed race marriage. And he said, well, that's impossible, absolutely not. Whereas I think, as you know, that, you know, we're moving toward a country where mixed is more common than ever. So he's a really interesting figure on race, complex.
I think
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I think I'll also just add a quote from Mark Twain that kind of adorned the T-shirts that we handed out to people along the way. He said, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness." Oh yeah, there you go.
Here's the back.
So we kind of that kind of was the mantra of the trip in a way. You know, it was a way for all the 3 of us to kind of diminish our ignorance about identity issues in the U.S. and, you know, clearly Twain did in his time as well.
Yeah, I must say that, you know, I am thrilled to have been part of your journey tonight, to caught a little glimpse and to meet some of the marvelous Americans that you met along the way. I want to let everyone know that we can learn meet even more of these people, because your book is coming out on October 25th. And there is one of our local bookstores, Books on the Commons in Ridgefield, will order the books for us. If somebody would like to just either call them or send an email to them, and they will order the book for you and have it here right around its release date. So, and they just asked us to do that before October 26th, if we could put our orders in. So, but I think, so are there, thank you. There you can see the cover of the book. Any other questions out there?